So this past winter, I played through Pokemon Scarlet, and I ended up having more fun with it than I expected. I thought the game was going to turn out like Sword and Shield, a half-baked, underdeveloped, straight-line tour of a region, but I was actually surprised with how much I enjoyed it overall. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is considered open world, but is it really though? You have some freedom in choosing your path through Paldea, but for the most part, you're locked to certain areas based on the strength of your team. Unfortunately, while Scarlet and Violet have a lot of good things going for them, one thing that is sorely lacking is a level scaling system based on your progression through the game. Each boss only has one team, so you can't just show up to Grusha on top of Glaciato Mountain and expect to beat them as your first accomplishment in Paldea. You'd certainly get destroyed by their team of high level 40s. Of course, locking certain pieces behind traversal skills like the gliding and swimming mechanics makes sense, but what if you'd showed up to Grusha first, and they didn't have level 40s? What if they had a team in the mid-teens to match your levels? This video sets out to answer the question of what the game would look like with appropriate level scaling. Honestly, this only took me like a few hours. Game Freak was really pressed for time with this game, huh? Let's set some ground rules. We're going to adhere to the level caps and the number of team members each boss trainer has, with some small exceptions. Keep each boss's ace Pokemon, and try not to overdo it on the move sets and difficulty. As someone who has a ton of experience with difficulty mods of Pokemon games, this limitation was the toughest thing for me to try and balance. Without further ado, here's Paldea bosses with level scaled teams. Let's start with Katie, since she's the first gym leader you're intended to face in the game. Katie's the bug-type gym leader, and honestly, she's very easy to beat. Her team of a Nimble, Tarantula, and Teddiursa each only have 2 moves, so this is going to be how we will model all future Boss 1 teams. 3 Pokemon, each with 2 moves. But what if she was the second boss you fought? Well, Nimble would stay the same, but her Tarantula would have evolved into a Spidops, upping the difficulty of the fight a tad. Teddiursa also would remain the same. Not too much change there. As the third boss, Katie would ditch her Nimble, as it has a really low base stat total, and add another Paldean bug type to her team, Reller. Yeah, it's ugly, but bring some additional coverage and roll out, dig, and pounce to try to shore up some weaknesses against fire and flying, types that are good against bug. Spidops would gain its signature move Silk Trap, and Teddiursa would ditch Fury Swipes for Covet and gain Rock Tomb to help it out versus those same fire and flying types. Boss 4 Katie would bring back her Nimble, except now that's a level 24, it has evolved into a Low Kicks. Low Kicks gets Lunge upon evolution and keeps Double Kick from its time as a Nimble. It also gains Assurance for access to a secondary stab. All other members would stay the same for this badge, but as Boss 5, Katie's new Reller would finally evolve into a Rabsca. This would change up its moveset from physically focused to specially focused, helping diversify her team. Access to Psybeam, Struggle Bug, and Mudshot round out its coverage and provide Katie with a fully evolved team outside of her Teddiursa. This changes when Katie's Boss 6, as now her Teddiursa has leveled up enough to finally become an Ursaring. This has her replace its Covet for Slash for a higher base power normal type move. Spidops also swaps out Assurance for Counter, so you'd better make sure you're using special moves or knocking it out in one hit. Boss 7, Katie's Rabsca, gains access to Extrasensory, but everything else stays the same besides the levels, of course. This also applies to Boss 8, Katie. Boss 9 Katie decides to shake things up a bit and ditches that low-powered Spidops for a Fortress, giving her a defensive Pokemon off the rip who can set up with Spikes, lower your speed with Pounce, or maybe hit a high-powered Heavy Slam. Low Kicks also ditches Assurance for the higher-powered Throat Chop, Rabsca gets rid of Mudshot for Recover, and Ursaring upgrades its Rock Tomb for Rock Slide. As Boss 10, Katie's Ursaring gains access to its final move slot, and adds Play Rough to its arsenal of attacks. Boss 11 Katie simply gains a few levels on her Pokemon, but as boss number 12, Katie gains access to her 5th Pokemon, as well as all of the move slots available. Her Fortress gains Volt Switch and replaces Heavy Slam with Gyro Ball. Her Low Kicks gains Bounce, her Rabsca gains Cosmic Power and replaces Extrasensory with Psychic, and Ursaring replaces Rock Slide with Stone Edge and Play Rough with High Horsepower. Katie also gains a Heracross with access to Pin Missile, Brick Break, Bulldoze, and Rock Slide. Again, we could give it Earthquake, Megahorn, Close Combat, and Stone Edge, but we're trying to adhere as best as possible to the power level of the original game. Boss 13 Katie stays exactly the same, besides her Low Kicks, who now has access to Axe Kick, so we ditch Double Leg. Double what? Double Leg? Did I just say Double Leg? Yeah, Low Kicks now has Axe Kick instead of Double Kick. So now that we have a good understanding of what we want this type of progression to look like for the bosses, let's move on to the second boss of the game, Brassius. Now for Brassius, we have to work backwards before we're able to go forwards, as Boss 1 Brassius' team stays exactly the same outside of his Sudowoodo, which devolves to a Bonsly. As boss 3, Brassius once again has Sudowoodo, which exchanges Rock Throw for Rock Tomb, as well as gains Slam, and Petalil, who gains Charm. However, Smoliv just isn't cutting it at this point, so instead, for boss 3 he's gonna rock a Sunflora with Growth, Mega Drain, and Light Screen. As boss 4, Brassius is able to have 4 team members, and brings back his Smoliv, now evolved into a Doliv, with Flail, Mega Drain, and Grassy Terrain. As boss 5, his Petalil is evolved into a Lilligant, and every instance of Mega Drain on his team has been exchanged for Giga Drain, making Sunflora and Doliv hit harder as well. As boss 6, Brassius has Sudowoodo replace Slam with Sucker Punch, and this carries on to boss 7 Brassius, where nothing has changed except for the levels, of course. Boss 8, Brassius' Doliv finally evolves into Arboliva, and has forgotten Flail for Swift, and now is going to take the Light Screen setting ability from Sunflora. His Sunflora at this point is a little below where we'd like his team to be at as far as power level, so instead, he's going to add a Breloom with Bullet Seed, Mach Punch, and Toxic. Sudowoodo at this point also drops Rock Tomb for Rock Slide. As boss 9, Brassius is pretty much the same, but as boss 10, Brassius' Lilligant replaces its Giga Drain with Petal Dance, Breloom replaces Bullet Seed with Seed Bomb, and Sudowoodo gains Bulldoze as its 4th coverage move. Boss 11 Brassius carries this team over, while boss 12 Brassius gets the 5th party slot and adds Toadscruel to the party, with Earth Power, Spore, Giga Drain, and Hex. Lilligant gains Leech Seed, Arboliva drops Swift for Hyper Voice and gains Reflect, Breloom gains Rock Tomb, and Sudowoodo replaces its Rock Slide with Head Smash, and Bulldoze with Earthquake. Boss 13 Brassius also maintains this team to round out all of his potential teams, whether he's fought as boss number 1 or boss number 13. One thing I'm starting to do while going through these teams is I like to let these bosses showcase some of the new Paldean Pokemon when I can. Toadscruel is an awesome Pokemon that I felt complemented Brassius' team nicely, and it's not usually seen in the main game, so I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to give it some love. Giacomo is up next, and we have to treat those Team Star bosses a little bit differently than their gym leader counterparts. Since they have their own Starmobiles, which have limited movesets, we're hardly going to touch them, and keep their moves within the boundaries of what we know a Team Starmobile can potentially do and learn. Even as the 3rd boss you're expected to fight in Paldea, Giacomo only has 2 Pokemon, his Pawniard and the Starmobile. This doesn't exactly follow our pattern of boss 3 teams having 3 Pokemon, so we're going to need to give Giacomo another party member for his team to fit with the trend that we've been setting. However, first, we need to work backwards. As boss number 1, Giacomo has his Pawniard, who's lost Fury Cutter, his Starmobile, which has lost Swift, but has added an Impidimp to the team with Draining Kiss and Bite. This helps out versus the potential fighting types, and I feel Impidimp is a good fit to his personality. Boss 2 Giacomo's team looks exactly the same as boss 1, and as boss 3, his Pawniard gains back Fury Cutter, his Starmobile gains back Swift, and his Impidimp learns Fake Out. As boss 4, Giacomo gets to add a new party member to his team, and I felt like adding Murkrow, because it increases the power level just enough, as well as fits with Giacomo's rebellious nature. This Murkrow comes with a moveset of Wing Attack, Thief, and Mud Slap. As boss 5, Giacomo's Impidimp replaces Bite with Sucker Punch, but everything else stays exactly the same as boss 4, besides levels. However, boss 6 Giacomo is where some of the bigger changes start taking place. His Impidimp evolves into Morgrem, replacing Fake Out with Light Screen, and Pawniard has finally fallen off a little bit in power, so it's been replaced by a Krokorok, who has Dig, Crunch, and Swagger. Boss 7 Giacomo stays roughly the same, but his Starmobile has been upgraded to carry Spin Out, Screech, and Flame Charge over Metal Sound, Snarl, and Swift. This puts it on par with some of the later Star Boss' Starmobiles. As boss 8, Giacomo's evolved his Murkrow into a Honchkrow, and for boss 9, the rest of his team follows suit, with Krokorok evolving into Crocodile and Morgrem evolving into Grimmsnarl. This team comes with some moveset upgrades, with Grimmsnarl gaining Spirit Break over Draining Kiss, Honchkrow replacing its Wing Attack, Mud Slap, and Thief for Drill Peck, Night Slash, and Thunder Wave, and Crocodile replaces Dig and Crunch for Earthquake and Foul Play. As boss 10, Giacomo's team only gains some levels, and as boss 11, Giacomo's Grimmsnarl replaces Sucker Punch with False Surrender. As boss 12, Giacomo gets access to his 5th slot, and he reintroduces his Pawniard to the team, now a King Gambit with access to Iron Head, Sucker Punch, X-Scissor, and Aerial Ace. Grimmsnarl gains Parting Shot, Honchkrow gains Comeuppance and replaces Drill Peck with Brave Bird, and Crocodile gains access to Aqua Tail to round out its coverage. As usual, boss 13 Giacomo stays the same as boss 12, with his final team looking exactly as it does outside of levels. I like to keep the same aces for these fights, while trying not to overlap too many Pokemon with Pokemon wielded by other bosses. Paldea introduces very few dark types besides Mabastip, who's Arven's good boy, and the legendary Treasures of Ruin. This causes Giacomo to have mostly non-Paldean Pokemon, but I think it still works in this case. Next up is Iono, who gives me a lot of good material to work with. Iono's definitely one of the tougher gym fights in Paldea, and working backwards with her team is rather easy. As Boss 1, Iono features a Wattrel with Thundershock and Pluck, a Shinx with Thundershock and Bite, and a Misdreavus with Charge Beam and Hex. Still decently powerful for a first gym leader, so I'd recommend staying away from Levincia until you've got a decently strong team. As Boss 2, Iono evolves her Shinx into a Luxio, and Boss 3 Iono gains access to her third move slot on all of her Pokemon, meaning her Wattrel now has access to Quick Attack, Luxio gains access to Double Kick, and Misdreavus gains that infamous Confuse Ray. As Boss 4, Iono's team is as it is in base Paldea. Notably, her Misdreavus is finally a Mismagius, except her Pokemon retain their third move slot being open, meaning Luxio retains Double Kick, and the newly added Belly Bolt gains Mud Slap. As Boss 5, Iono evolves her Wattrel into a Kilowattrel, replacing Spark with Electro Ball, and her Belly Bolt replaces Water Gun and Mud Slap for Water Pulse and Mud Shot to shore up its power level. As Boss 6, Iono remains the same as Boss 5, but as Boss 7, Iono's Kilowattrel ditches Quick Attack for Roost, and her Luxio finally evolves into its final form, Luxray. As Boss 8, Iono's Luxray ditches Spark for Volt Switch, her Belly Bolt ditches Spark for Discharge, and her Mismagius upgrades her Confuse Ray to Will-O-Wisp, making this Pokemon less RNG based and harder to tackle for physical threats. As Boss 9, Iono changes out her Luxray's Bite for Ice Fang, and her Belly Bolt's Water Pulse for Muddy Water. Her Mismagius also gets another upgrade, learning Thunderbolt in place of Charge Beam. It's no longer able to boost with Charge Beam, but it is going to hit hard with Stab Thunderbolt. As Boss 10, Iono stays the same, but her Mismagius unlocks the fourth move slot, now running Draining Kiss. As Boss 11, Iono remains as Boss 10's, but Boss 12 is where she gets her fifth Pokemon, adding Pincurchin to her team. I thought this made sense since it's a terrain setter, and Levincia is located on the shore of the East Paldean Sea, where Pincurchin is found. Her Pincurchin is carrying Zing Zap, Toxic Spikes, Poison Jab, and Liquidation, helping power up her remaining team members and setting terrain for 5 turns. Her Kilowattrel ditches Dual Wing Beat for Hurricane and adds Tailwind to its repertoire. Luxray gains Crunch, Belly Bolt gains Sucker Punch, and Mismagius ditches Will-O-Wisp for Mystical Fire. As Boss 13, Iono's team remains exactly as it was as Boss 12's, except for the obvious increase in levels. Mila is the second Team Star boss, and a really interesting case as she only carries 2 Pokemon in her fight, despite being the 5th boss overall. This causes us to have to be a bit creative working backwards from her Torkoal Starmobile combo. As Boss 1, Mila's gonna have a Houndour with Ember and Thief, and a Larvesta with Flame Charge and Struggle Bug. Her Revavroom only has 3 move slots available at this point, so we keep Blazing Torque, Screech, and Swift, ditching Overheat as it's too powerful for this point in the game. Boss 2 Mila is exactly the same, but as Boss 3, Mila's Houndour gains access to Smog, and her Larvesta gains Absorb, rounding out her coverage a little bit. This also finally opens up her Revavroom to have access to Overheat. This might be a little too strong for this point, but the Starmobiles are ridiculous in vanilla anyways, and Overheat only really hits like a truck one time before the special attack decrease kicks in. As Boss 4, Mila evolves her Houndour into a Houndour, replacing Ember with Incinerate. Her Larvesta subs out Absorb for Giga Drain, and she adds a Carkol to the team since she's unlocked the 4th slot, packing Flame Charge, Ancient Power, and Rapid Spin. As Boss 5, Mila ditches her Larvesta for her signature Torkoal, with its moveset of Flame Wheel and Clear Smog, while also gaining Yawn as a way to work better as a lead. Her newly added Carkol and Houndoom remain on the team, making this level-scaled fight particularly more complex than her original battle. As Boss 6, Mila's Houndoom drops Smog for Thunderfang, and Boss 7, Mila's Torkoal replaces Flame Wheel and Clear Smog for Lava Plume and Sludge Bomb, respectively. This also now means that her Starmobile gains access to Spin Out, which it's going to carry over Screech for the remainder of her fights. As Boss 8, Mila's Carkol has reached its final form in Colossal, but Mila pivots in Boss 9, replacing her Houndoom with a Paldean Fire-type Inscovillain. I thought it was strange how neither the Grass or Fire-type specialists had this Pokemon on their teams in Vanilla, and I felt this one specifically fit Mila way more than Brassius. I mean, it has Villain in its name for one thing. This new Scovillain comes with Flamethrower, Giga Drain, and Crunch, and with access to Chlorophyll, it can prove to be deadly if the sun from Torkoal is still up by the time it hits the field. As Boss 10, Mila stays the same as Boss 9, but for Boss 11, her Colossal ditches Flame Charge for the move Heat Crash. As Boss 12, Mila gains access to the 5th slot on her team. And what else to add but another Paldean Fire type in Paldean Tauros. Specifically, its Blaze breed. Her Torkoal gains Body Press, her Colossal gains Spikes, her Scovillain gains Solar Beam, and Tauros' moveset consists of Raging Bull, Zen Headbutt, Wild Charge, and Close Combat. By Boss 13, Mila has come into her own, with 2 new Paldean fire types and some shored up coverage and power levels. I decided not to add either Armor Rouge or Ceruledge to her team because it wouldn't fit with the cutscenes that come before and after her battle, with Charlos, the Char Cadet. Now, let's talk about Kofu, as this was a boss I had particular trouble scaling for due to there being such a wide variety of water types in Paldea, making it hard to choose what Pokemon he'd have access to. Boss 1 Kofu has his Wugtrio and Crabominable devolve into Wiglet and Crabrawler respectively, but since we need a third Pokemon for this first team, and Veluza's too strong for this point, Kofu has another Paldean water type instead, Finizen. Finizen has access to Aqua Jet and Astonish, Wiglet has Aqua Jet and Mud Slap, and his Crabrawler has Bubble Beam and Rock Smash. Boss 2 Kofu retains the squad for the time being, but as Boss 3, Kofu's Finizen learns Double Hit, his Wiglet learns Slam, and his Crabrawler exchanges Bubble Beam for Crabhammer, and also gains Slam. As Boss 4, Kofu gets access to another slot, and he adds Veluza back to the team, with its moves of Water Pulse, Pluck, and Slash. And he also evolves Wiglet back into Wugtrio, who replaces Aqua Jet with Water Pulse and Slam with the more consistent Headbutt. Kofu's Finizen replaces Aqua Jet with Dive and Astonish with Charm at this point, and his ace Crabrawler has finally reached its final form in Crabominable. Boss 5 Kofu remains the same as Boss 4, although his Veluza does gain access to Aqua Cutter over Water Pulse. As Boss 6, Kofu's Finizen replaces Double Hit with Acrobatics, and as Boss 7, Kofu's team gets a small power boost with his Wugtrio learning Triple Dive over Water Pulse and Bulldoze over Mud Slap. His Crabominable also replaces Slam with Stab Ice Punch. I thought it was really silly that his Crabominable didn't have a Stab Ice move in the vanilla games, so this is a much needed alteration. As Boss 8, Kofu's Veluza gains Night Slash over Slash, and Wugtrio replaces Headbutt with Sucker Punch. As boss number 9, Kofu's Finizen has finally achieved its final form in Palafin, who ditches Dive and Charm for Flip Turn and Jet Punch. This Pokemon is ridiculously powerful, and it surprises me that no trainer in the main game used it at all. It fits nicely on Kofu's physically oriented water-type team. Veluza also gains Psycho Cut over Pluck, and Crabominable replaces Rock Smash with Reversal. As boss 10, Kofu's Crabominable gains access to its 4th move in Earthquake and retains this throughout boss 11. As boss 12, Kofu gets a 5th team member, like Mila before, which is Paldean Tauros, except this time it's going to be the Aqua breed. With access to Raging Bull, Zen Headbutt, Wild Charge, and Close Combat, this gives Kofu 4 physically oriented Paldean water types, along with his ace Crabominable as his definitive team. His Palafin gains Ice Punch, his Veluza gains Drill Run, and his Wugtrio gains Rain Dance. Boss 13 Kofu remains the same as boss 12, keeping his new team of All-Stars as the final gym leader in the story. I'm really happy with how Kofu's team turned out in particular, as it went through a number of drafts to end up at this point. Moving on to the 3rd Team Star boss Atticus. Atticus was another boss that went through a number of drafts to help his team fit both his ninja theme and reflect Paldea a little bit better. As boss 1, Atticus has a Shroodle, Poison Fang, and Metronome, and a Skrelp with Water Pulse and Acid Spray. These are both relatively low-powered poison types that work with his theme. He also keeps his Starmobile, and it's been downgraded to have Noxious Torque, Swift, and Smog. As boss 2, Atticus's team remains the same, but as boss 3, Atticus adds Stunky to the party over Shroodle, with a moveset of Acid Spray, Bite, and Poison Gas. His Skrelp gains Icy Wind, and the Starmobile adds Flame Charge to its moveset. As boss 4, Atticus adds Varoom to his lineup, a Paldean poison type that finds a spot on his permanent roster, with access to Gyro Ball, Sludge, and Lick. His Stunky also swaps out Acid Spray for Venoshock. Boss 5 Atticus sees the return of his Shroodle, now a Grafai-Eye, which replaces his Skrelp as its power level is just too low for this point in the game. Grafai-Eye carries U-Turn, Slash, and Poison Fang. Boss 6 Atticus's Stunky ditches Poison Gas for the much superior Toxic, and his Varoom evolves into its final form of Revavaroom, ditching Lick for the higher powered Assurance. Boss 7 Atticus swaps out Grafai-Eye for Muck, which to me is a downgrade, but there is a Muck on the base team, as underwhelming as it is. This new Muck with 3 move slots available is going to have Sludge Wave, Mud Slap, and Hex. In addition, Stunky evolves into Skuntank, losing Bite for Sucker Punch. His Starmobile's moveset has also leveled up, replacing Swift with Spin Out. As boss 8, Atticus's Muck changes out Mud Slap for Mud Shot, as Mud Slap is really too weak of a move to run in the mid-30s. Revavaroom ditches Sludge and rounds out its physical coverage with Poison Jab. His Starmobile also changes out Smog for Poison Gas at this point. As boss 9, Atticus's Skuntank loses Sucker Punch for Night Slash. I usually don't like when enemy trainers have Sucker Punch, as it can be highly exploited by the player and and usually it's used at inopportune times. Plus, without any other Dark Stab and Skuntank's decent speed stat, I felt it could afford to lose Sucker Punch. As boss 10, Atticus ditches the muck and brings back his Grafai Eye, who instead of U-turn now has Substitute to take advantage of Prankster and help prevent setup. This is all the changes between boss 9 and 10, but for boss 11, his Grafai Eye instead gets knockoff in place of Slash to help deal with opposing Steel and Ghost types a bit better. Boss 12 Atticus now has access to his 5th Pokemon slot and all 4 move slots, so Grafai Eye gets a massive upgrade with Gunk Shot instead of Poison Jab and adds Toxic to its arsenal, making this the first almost legitimately competitive set this Pokemon runs. Atticus adds back Scrub to his party, which is now evolved into a Dragalge. This comes with a pretty nice special attacking moveset of Dragon Pulse, Venoshock, Surf, and Shadow Ball. His Skuntank gains Flamethrower as its 4th move, and Revavroom replaces Poison Jab with Gunk Shot, as well as adds Overheat as its own 4th move. Like the other Team Starmobiles, Atticus's replaces Poison Gas with Shift Gear, allowing it to set up even further in conjunction with Flame Charge. Boss 13 Atticus is exactly the same as Boss 12 outside of levels. Overall, I'm happy with Atticus's progression, but I felt there were still so many Pokemon that I considered for a spot on the team. It really feels redundant to have both Revavroom and a Starmobile, but I wanted to make sure he had both the new Paldea and Poison types. Now on to Larry. Larry's an interesting case, as Normal is the most common type in Paldea pre-DLC, meaning that he has a number of options for his team. I figured that starting with some of the Paldea normal types was a great way of adding some flair to his team. Boss 1 Larry starts with a Tandemaus with both Double Hit and Super Fang, and a Lechonk with Covet and Mud Shot. He keeps his ace, but of course it's devolved to a Staravia, who only has access to Facade and Aerial Ace. Boss 2 Larry stays the same, but for Boss 3 his Tandemaus gains Bullet Seed to help him deal with the Rock types who do well versus his team. Lechonk evolves into an Oinkologne and gains Disarming Voice to potentially help with fighting types. Staravia gains Thief as well as a way to hit Ghost types, since Larry's team doesn't do too well versus Ghost types in general. I think this is a necessary step to allow Staravia to deal with them more effectively. Boss 4 Larry ditches his Tandemaus for a Dunsparce with access to Flail, Ancient Power, and Glare, allowing opportunity to get out of hand really fast. He also adds Komala to the squad at this point, with access to Rapid Spin, Yawn, and Rock Tomb. As Boss 5, Larry returns with his Tandemaus, now evolved into a Mousehold, who replaces Oinkologne, who, spoiler alert, will not be making a return. As Boss 6, Larry's Komala loses Rapid Spin for Slam, which in my opinion is a downgrade, but that's what it carries in the base game, so we're gonna roll with it. Mousehold loses Super Fang for Play Rough as another coverage move, and Staravia somehow evolves into Staraptor at level 30 here. I thought this was a fine spot to give him his fully evolved ace, but I understand if you're someone who doesn't like when enemy trainers have Pokemon before their actual evolution level. This is something the Pokemon Company has historically never had a problem with though, so I didn't mind doing it here. Boss 7 Larry has ditched Rock Tomb on Komala for Sucker Punch, and his Dunsparce has finally evolved into the Dunsparce. This requires it to have Hyper Drill, and it replaces the Ancient Power Cheese with Drill Run, leaving Glare. Boss 8 Larry is the same as 7, but at Boss 9, Larry's Komala loses the unimpressive Slam for Woodhammer. This does give it no normal stab, but I don't think that's a big deal since it has a high attack stat anyway. Komala is really cool, but pretty underwhelming for the most part, so for Boss 10, Larry ditches it for another normal type that no other trainer in the region uses, being Indeedee. This Indeedee comes packing Psychic, Shadow Ball, and Swift. At this point, Staraptor gains access to its 4th move slot as well, adding Close Combat to its repertoire and rounding out its coverage. Boss 11 Larry stays the same as 10, but Boss 12 and 13 Larry get to add new Pokemon to the squad. I'm opting to add Cyclizar since it's a Paldean normal type, and I think that having a Dragon type on his team really adds something special and distinct. Cyclizar comes packing Double Edge, Dragon Claw, Shift Gear, and Crunch. At this point, Indeedee trades out Swift for Hyper Voice and adds Fake Out. The Dunsparce gets access to Roost, letting it keep itself healthy and becoming much harder to kill. Mousehold finally gets access to its signature move, a Population Bomb, and also adds Bite to its moveset, giving it coverage to hit those pesky Ghost types. Lastly, Larry's Staraptor maintains Close Combat, Facade, and Thief, but gains Brave Bird, letting it hit even harder than previously. Like most of these Boss 12 splits, Larry maintains this team for Boss 13. Again, with there being so many normal types in Paldea, it was hard to decide which Pokemon Larry should have had. Early drafts with him had members of the Chansey line and the Yungoos line, but overall, I'm happy with the balance we struck here. Rime's an interesting case, as she's the only gym leader in the game who battles in a double format. Real VGC player over here. Because of this, 3 Pokemon felt like an off number for her team to have, and as such, for Boss 1, she actually starts with a 4, breaking the rule. First up is Shuppet, who has both Will-O-Wisp and Nightshade, letting it support its teammates with extra set damage and status conditions. Her Houndstone is devolved into a Grievard, who only carries both Lick and Headbutt. One thing I dislike about Rime's base game team is that she only has one Paldean Pokemon. Despite there being a few Paldean Ghosts, moves, seen very few times throughout the game. For this reason, I've decided to add Bramblin to her team, who is a unique grass ghost and comes packing Bullet Seed and Rapid Spin. In addition, her ace Toxtricity is of course a Toxel, who has Acid and Terra Blast? Yes, I opted to give her Toxel Terra Blast since, well, here's Toxel's learn set. Yeah, it leaves a lot to be desired, huh? Her team stays this way for the Boss 2 split, but since each of her Pokemon gain access to 3 moves for Boss 3, things definitely get more interesting. Her Shuppet gains Shadow Sneak, her Greavard gains Dig, her Bramblin gains Hex, and her Toxel gains Nuzzle. Yeah, the only electric move it gets prior to evolving. Rime's Boss 4 team replaces Shuppet for Mimikyu, who carries Baby Doll Eyes, Shadow Sneak, and Light Screen to help support her team's hit-taking ability. Her Bramblin also evolves into a Bramblegast, maintaining its moveset, and finally, her Toxel somehow evolves into Toxtricity here, with a completely overhauled moveset of Spark, Acid Spray, and Hex. I got rid of Terra Blast since it's probably too strong for this point in the game, and just like in Larry's section, I felt that evolving it early was completely acceptable, because having a Pokemon with Toxel's stats as your ace is just sad. Boss 5, Rime's Brambleghast opts to replace Bullet Seed for Mega Drain, helping it stay healthy throughout the second half of the battle. For Boss 6, Greavard replaces Headbutt for Crunch, letting it deal with opposing ghosts a bit better. As Boss 7, Rime evolves her Greavard into a Houndstone, but everything else remains consistent. As Boss 8, Rime's Brambleghast once again upgrades its coverage, replacing Mega Drain with Giga Drain. But the real impactful changes come for Boss 9, as she starts to reflect her vanilla team a little bit better. Mimikyu ditches Baby Doll Eyes for Slash, her Houndstone changes out Lick for Phantom Force, and Dig for Play Rough, and Shuppet makes a return in the form of Bayonet, whose moveset consists of Icy Wind, Sucker Punch, and Shadow Sneak. Toxtricity also receives an overhaul in its moveset, replacing Spark with Discharge and Acid Spray with Hyper Voice. The only change made to Rime for her Boss 10 split is Toxtricity, replacing Discharge with the far superior Overdrive and gaining Sludge Wave as its 4th move for a good way to hit both opponents on the other side of the field with a strong Poison type attack. She maintains this team as Boss 11, but her Boss 12 team once again receives a pretty substantial overhaul. Mimikyu loses Slash for Play Rough, Shadow Sneak for Shadow Claw, and gains Will-O-Wisp, replacing Shuppet's early purpose of statusing opponents off the get-go. Houndstone gets back Dig, but replaces Phantom Force for its pseudo-signature move Last Respect. Since Houndstone hits the field relatively early in the battle, this shouldn't get too out of hand, and with Sand Rush instead of Fluffy, it isn't too fast or bulky for it to be as broken as Gen 9 competitive made it out to be. Brambleghast once again replaces Bayonet and comes packing the new Spikes, letting her team accrue passive damage. Finally, as her 5th Pokemon, she adds Ceruledge, with Shadow Claw, Bitter Blade, Brick Break, and Will-O-Wisp. For how much marketing Ceruledge got prior to the game's release, it sure is used relatively few times throughout the game itself. Toxtricity remains unchanged from previous splits, and like most of the Boss 13 splits I've made, her team remains unchanged outside of levels. Tulip is a weird case, as once again, there are a number of Pokemon that I felt deserved a spot on her team, but I had trouble fitting them, so I did my best to represent her type as best as possible. If Tulip is the first boss you take on, she runs a Flittle with Confusion and Pluck, a Meditite with Confusion and Force Palm, and a Flabebe with Stored Power and Draining Kiss. Flabebe doesn't get any other psychic moves besides Store Power and Psychic, so even though she can't boost her stats in any way, Stored Power is the best low power move I could come up with besides Terra Blast. As Boss 2, Tulip remains the same, but Boss 3 Tulip replaces Flittle with Girafarig, who carries Psybeam, Assurance, and Reflect. Meditite gains access to Fake Out and replaces Confusion with Psybeam, and Flabebe has evolved into Floette, gaining Razor Leaf as an additional coverage move. As Boss 4, Tulip gains a 4th Pokemon and adds Kirlia to the team, who's packing Psybeam, Dazzling Gleam, and Magical Leaf. At this point, Floette gains Psychic, as I feel that it's not too overpowered for this stage in the game. Boss 5 Tulip's Meditite upgrades its moveset from Psybeam and Force Palm to Zen Headbutt and High Jump Kick. This is all that I touched here, but for the Boss 6 split, it evolves into Medicham, once again a little bit early. But Meditite lacks so much power that I felt it necessary. Floette finally reaches its final form in Florges here as well, upgrading its Draining Kiss for a Moonblast and replacing Razor Leaf for Petal Blizzard. As Boss 7, her Girafarig has Twin Beam, foreshadowing its eventual return as a Farigiraf, and her Kirlia evolves into its final form in Gardevoir. As Boss 8, Tulip has used Twin Beam enough, and her Girafarig finally evolved into Farigiraf. This comes with an upgraded moveset consisting of Crunch instead of Assurance, and immediately ditching the Twin Beam for Zen Headbutt. She loses her Medicham at this point, bringing back her Flittle, which is now an Espathra, who packs Psychic, Quick Attack, and Shadow Ball. Gardevoir also upgrades its Psybeam for Psychic and Magical Leaf for Energy Ball. This carries over into boss split 9, which is her vanilla team, and for boss split 10, her only change is that Florges is given synthesis to keep itself healthy. As boss 11, Tulip's Espathra loses quick attack for Dazzling Gleam, and as boss 12, Tulip gets to reach her final form. This comes with an overhaul of movesets for all of her Pokemon. Farigiraf regains Twin Beam and adds Hyper Voice to its arsenal, gaining a powerful normal stab. Espathra, despite being a Gen 9 Psychic type, is also used by Champion Gita, and so for that reason, I opted to drop Espathra to bring back Medicham, who retains Fake Out and Zen Headbutt, but adds Axe Kick and Thunder Punch to its moveset. Gardevoir gains Mystical Fire, and Florges upgrades Petal Blizzard to Giga Drain. For her 5th Pokemon, I decided that Armarouge would be a great fit, as no other trainer is really seen with one. This comes with Psyshock, Flamethrower, Aura Sphere, and Will-O-Wisp, letting it hit decently hard, deal with dark types, and also cripple physical attackers prior to Florges hitting the field. She retains this team as the final boss you take on. I'm pretty happy with what we did with Tulip's overhauled team, as I always thought it was weird that she had 2 Medicham bodyguards, but never ended up sending one into battle. For the final gym leader of the game, Grusha proved to be a tricky one to scale. If they're taken on as the first boss, their team consists of a Citadel with Yawn and Ice Shard, a Cubchoo with Aqua Jet and Powder Snow, and her ace of Altaria, who is now a Swablu, comes packing Ice Beam and Pluck. Yes, Ice Beam. It doesn't get any other Ice-type coverage move outside of Terra Blast, but I didn't feel like Ice Beam was too strong coming off a base 40 special attack. If you happen to climb the mountain, get ready for the Swablu with Ice Beam. Grusha retains this team for the boss 2 split, but for boss 3, their Citadel gains Takedown. Her Cubchoo gains Brine and replaces Powder Snow with Frost Breath. Swablu also gains access to Dragon Breath. Grusha's team sees a massive upgrade for boss 4, adding Snover to the team, who comes packing the obligatory Snow Warning, as well as Icy Wind, Razor's Leaf, and Ice Shard. In addition, they dropped the Cubchoo for a much stronger Pokemon in Frostmoth, who has Icy Wind, Struggle Bug, and Stun Spore. Finally, in probably the most egregious example of a Pokemon being evolved prior to its canon level, their Swablu has reached its final form in Altaria, who dishes Dragon Breath for the superior Dragon Pulse. This makes Grusha a really difficult fight for this point in the game, but the difficulty is offset by the Ice type being, well, bad. Maintaining the team for boss split 5, as boss 6, Grusha evolves their Citadel into Cetitan, losing Yawn for Avalanche. Their Frostmoth loses Icy Wind for Ice Beam, and Altaria once again upgrades a coverage move, losing Pluck for Hurricane. As boss 7, Grusha ditches Snover, as its power level has certainly fallen off a bit, and replaces it with Ice Cube, who comes with Ice Spinner, Surf, and Zen Headbutt. Cetitan loses Takedown for Liquidation as well, making Grusha's team have some decent coverage against the fire types it so badly loses to. No changes for boss 8, but as boss 9, Grusha's Frostmoth loses Struggle Bug for Bug Buzz and replaces Ice Beam for the higher-powered Blizzard. As boss 10, Grusha brings back Cubchoo, who's now a Beartic instead of Ice Cube, with a moveset consisting of Aqua Jet, Icicle Crash, and Earthquake. Altaria also gains its 4th coverage move, slotting Moonblast in the last slot. Boss 11 Grusha stays the same as 10, but for boss 12, Grusha adds Snover, now an Abomasnow, back to the team with a moveset of Blizzard, Woodhammer, Aurora Veil, and Ice Shard. Grusha also decides to ditch Frostmoth for Glaceon with Freeze Dry, Blizzard, Shadow Ball, and Water Pulse. Beartic gains Superpower, and Cetitan gains Bounce, rounding out Grusha's team for a few Hail abusers. This probably doesn't prevent Skeledirge from sweeping outright still, but hey, we weren't going for difficulty in the first place. Ortega of Team Star is up next, and for boss 1, Ortega packs a Fido with Play Rough and Bite, a Jigglypuff with Echoed Voice and Draining Kiss, and of course the Starmobile with Magical Torque, Swift, and Confuse Ray. Again, if you feel like Play Rough is too strong for this point, blame Game Freak for not creating more physical fairy moves, as Play Rough is the only damaging fairy move that Fido gets by level up, and the only other fairy move it gets period is Dazzling Gleam. Boss 2 Ortega remains the same, but for boss 3, he opts to evolve his Jigglypuff into Wigglytuff, adding Charm to its arsenal. This gives Ortega a little bit more bulk to his team and adds a spike in difficulty. Most likely you won't be this far north since you begin the game in Cabo Poco, so if you do choose to do Ortega this soon, prepare for a tough battle. Fido also adds Mudslap to its moveset, and the Starmobile adds Flame Charge. As boss 4, Ortega adds Azumarill with Aqua Jet, Play Rough, and Bounce, and for boss 5, Fido evolves into Doxbund. For boss 6, Fido loses Bite for Crunch, but that's the only change that we make. As boss 7, Ortega kicks it up a notch. Azumarill swaps out Aqua Jet for Aqua Tail, and the Starmobile dons its final moveset of Magical Torque, Spin Out, Steel Roller, and Confuse Ray. As boss 8, Ortega's Wigglytuff gets a moveset overhaul, now packing Body Slam and Gyro Ball over Echoed Voice and Charm, and this team will stay this way all the way from bosses 9 to 11. However, as boss 12, Ortega adds Klefki to his squad as the 5th member, with Light Screen, Reflect, Effect, Ironhead, and Play Rough. Darkspun adds Baby Doll Eyes, Wigglytuff ditches Body Slam for Hyper Voice and also adds Thunder Wave, and his Azumarill adds Ice Punch. Ortega proves to mellow out as he increases in difficulty, but if you fight him early game, you're in for a rough time. The last boss of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is Arie, who is the final Team Star fight and the final boss we'll be scaling today. Her team for Boss 1 consists of a Riolu with Force Palm and Bite, a Mankey with Assurance and Low Kick, and a Revavroom with Combat Torque, Swift, and Bulldoze. Once again, there were a lot of fighting types to choose from, but I think I'm happy with de-evolving her members. The beauty of Arie is that we don't need to work forwards at all, since we've already been provided with her final team. Boss 2 Arie remains the same as Boss 1. Like pretty much all of the bosses we bounce here today, Boss 3 Arie adds Metal Claw to Riolu's moveset, and Mankey adds Rock Tomb. As Boss 4, Arie adds her Krogunk to the squad, with Venoshock, Low Sweep, and Sucker Punch, and evolves her Riolu into a Lucario, who now rocks Aura Sphere over Force Palm. Mankey also adds Cross Chop to its moveset in place of Low Kick. Revavroom also gets access to Screech, rounding out its early game moveset. As Boss 5, Arie evolves her Mankey into Primeape, but everything else remains consistent. As Boss 6, Arie loses her Krogunk for a Hawlucha, who comes packing Brick Break, Aerial Ace, and Rock Tomb. As Boss 7, Arie sees some upgrades in her movesets. Primeape loses Rock Tomb for Ice Punch, and Lucario ditches Bite for Dark Pulse, and Metal Claw for Flash Cannon. The Starmobile also loses Screech for Spin Out. As Boss 8, the only change that's made is Primeape loses Assurance for Rage Fist, foreshadowing the inevitable Annihilate. Boss 9 remains the same as Boss 8, but for Boss 10, her Hawlucha ditches Brick Break for Flying Press, her Starmobile ditches Swift for Shift Gear, and finally her Primeape evolves into Annihilate, with its moveset being Rage Fist, Close Combat, and Ice Punch. As Boss 11, Toxicroak is able to make its return to the team, replacing Hawlucha for a spot once again. It comes back with Sucker Punch, Brick Break, and Poison Jab. Finally, for Bosses 12 and 13, Arie's team looks as it does in Vanilla, with Toxicroak adding Ice Punch, Passimian adding High Horsepower, Lucario adding Dragon Pulse, and Annihilate adding Fire Punch. That concludes our rebalancing and level scaling for all of the bosses in Paldea. I did my best not to make any fight too difficult, but in my eyes, Pokemon should always have 4 moves, especially in the final stretch of the game, so adding extra coverage goes a long way in differentiating the later game fights from the early game fights. I definitely had more fun with the earlier bosses as I could get creative with their team comps, but working backwards from late game fights was also an interesting challenge. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, but let me know what you think of my proposed changes and what you'd change for every boss and their team if Paldea was actually level scaled. Maybe one day, someone will develop a mod that implements this type of level scaling into Paldea, but Scarlet and Violet is a broken mess as it is, so maybe Game Freak could step in and fix some of these issues themselves. Thank you all so much for sticking with me until the end. If you enjoy this type of content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. It's a little bit different than what we usually do, but something I definitely felt passionately about and was something I had a lot of fun doing. Thank you all so much for watching. Till next time.